Good afternoon. My name is Mark Bristow. I am the director of MITRE's Cyber Infrastructure Protection Innovation Center, or CIPIC. It's a new organization at MITRE that is focused on helping secure cyber infrastructure, including critical infrastructure and operational technology. So we're really excited. I recently joined MITRE. I was there, did 14 years at DHS CISA, some of my colleagues here already. But really enjoying over here at MITRE, building some scalable solutions that can help us defend our infrastructure. Of course, with me is Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Freeman. Happy to be here again, second time at RSA. I guess the other thing, in addition to everything Mark mentioned, I also work for CIPIC. Before that, I came from the Department of Energy. And I'm a little bit sleep deprived right now since this is my first conference after having a baby. So
round of applause for Sarah.
New mom.
New mom.
New mom struggles. I've caffeinated, but probably not enough. So apologize for that. I'm gonna do some jumping on this side just to wake up a little bit.
Anytime you do jumping jacks, just rock it out.
I don't want to bounce the floor. I totally do it.
All right. So here's your standard RSA disclaimer. I'm not going to read it to you because you've probably seen it now at least 4 or 5 different times. So you've got it. But take everything we say with a grain of salt. We're not lawyers. We're not here to advise you on risk. Yada yada yada. Anyway, so show of hands. Who here has all the resources they need to fix all the vulnerabilities that they have?
As long as Mark's paying for it, everyone. Right?
Yeah, I got like 20 bucks, right? That'll make it happen, right? Yeah, so we have a problem in cybersecurity, right? And I think that I've been doing this for quite some time, as is Sarah, and like when we started this kind of this journey, right? Finding that new 0 day or finding that new vulnerability was something that happened like once every month, 2 months. Maybe you get that like CVSS 10 score one, like maybe once a year, right? You weren't getting a lot of vulnerabilities and that kind of stuff discovery, right? Well, now, in 2022, 26,000 vulnerabilities, software flaws being reported, right? We now have a huge number of vulnerabilities, and our methodology that we had employed was patch all the things, right? And at these types of scales, right, that's not necessarily viable. Even when you just reduce it down to the critical vulnerabilities, you're still talking about more vulnerabilities than any one organization can potentially mitigate in a realistic way, right? And I'm here to tell you that we're looking at this problem wrong. Fundamentally, we're spending our time and our energy on things that ultimately won't necessarily actually stop adversary action in our environment, right? And so we have a massive problem with defensive inefficiencies, right? We have these patch all the things, we have the security things, we got to make that whole adage of, oh, the adversary has to only be right once, defenders have to be right 100 times, right? We got to flip the script here, because at the end of the day, we don't have all the time and money that we need in order to fix all the things. Would I love it if we could fix all the things? Absolutely, that would be spectacular. But I live in the real world where like we can't do that, right? And so we need to figure out what to start with, right? And that really is, and one of the big problems with this is that we're not really looking at it in a complete way. We're looking at, okay, well, we have a vulnerability in this piece of software. We've got a vulnerability in this piece of hardware, right? And we can fix all those things, but at the end of the day, we have to actually do stuff that's going to stop the bad guys, right? Because that's what we're all here for. Is anyone here to not stop bad guys from getting in their environment? Who here is a bad guy? I mean, I thought I'd ask, right? Somebody might raise their hand. Bad AppSec, right? So, and if you look at kind of what's out there in reporting, and the Director of National Intelligence puts out these annual threat assessments every year. And if you've been watching them over time, like the drumbeat of the problem is just getting louder, right? They went so far in the 2003 annual threat assessment, which recently came out, that said not only do our major nation-state adversaries have existing capabilities to hold our infrastructure at risk, not they're building it or they might have it in 10 years, they've got them now. Not only do they have them, but they're going to employ them not only to go after our military assets, which depending on how you feel about that, most people kind of think is in play, right, to go after other nations' military infrastructure. But not just the military infrastructure, also our people, right? The DNI actually put out that it was to defray societal panic, right? They're now talking about using cyber effects against critical infrastructure as part of a way to deter the United States from taking action by hacking all of you, right? And all the people you work for and your families, right? They're counting on, our adversaries are counting on things like denying us access to clean water will stop us from doing things to achieve political goals. This is a completely new game, right? Before, when we were talking about vulnerabilities, again, we're looking at these vulnerabilities in systems, and while there have been examples of successful cyber effects operations against critical infrastructure, it was always in this kind of, oh, well, that only happened during warfare, that always happened, it's gonna happen over there to somebody else. Oh, it only happened in Ukraine, I don't have to worry about it, right? Well, now we're in a different context. And quite frankly, the geopolitical condition is getting a little bit worse, right? We see things in, obviously the Russian aggression in Ukraine. We see Chinese bolstering and kind of posturing for potential, as they refer to it, reunification of Taiwan. And so the geopolitical context is getting us to a place where this is something we need to be really worried about, and soon. And if we're spending all of our time and resources trying to fix all the things, we are not going to be ready for whenever this wave comes, right? And that's really what we have kind of put together as a way to do this a little bit better. And traditionally, we've looked at this kind of how we do our cyber defense. It really is a team sport, right? And we've focused a lot on that threat intelligence component of cyber defense, right? Lots of companies out there doing some really, really great work. Lots of government out there doing great work. Sat through the panel with General Hartman and EAD Goldstein, talking about how they're partnering and enabling. All that stuff is really, really great. But at the end of the day, no one else is going to fix your stuff, right? We are ultimately responsible for our own things. And so that threat intelligence piece is critical, and it's gotten a lot of attention, but it's not enough, right? We need to be focused not only on the threat intelligence component, but also on like engineering, right? When it comes to critical infrastructure, at the end of the day, physics matters, right? If you're doing IT incident response or IT security, you don't really have to think about physics models, but when it comes to, cracking hydrocarbons, yeah, you got to understand physics, right? So how does the engineering piece tie into the cybersecurity piece with that threat context? How do we combine those three things in a way that ultimately gives us that prioritization for resources? Because none of you raised your hand and said you had all the money you need, right? So the next question is, okay, in a resource-constrained environment, what do I fix next, right? And I ran a Birds of a Feather session this morning, and I asked this question to those in the Birds of a Feather, and no one had an answer. That some of them were like, oh, whatever my executives read about in the newspaper yesterday, that's what we fix next. That's not a good plan, especially considering the overall context, right? We got to be defending these systems now and doing it smartly, outsmarting our adversaries. So how do we bring those engineering concepts, right? Failure mode analysis, hazard analysis, safety analysis. The one thing that frustrates me a lot when it comes to cyber in industrial control systems environments is people aren't talking to their safety engineers, right? The safety engineers have already worked out all the bad days you can have. That's their job, right? So how do we combine that knowledge and get it into a predictable, repeatable method with the cybersecurity expertise about what parts of the control system could cause those bad day failures, and then add in that threat intelligence context and say, okay, with the intersection of those three things, that will help tell me what we have to actually fix first. But you got to kind of know yourself, you got to know the adversary, and you got to understand what you're trying to avoid. Because let me tell you, not every hack of an industrial control system environment is going to put health and safety at risk. Not all of them. You go after a SENS system, smokestack monitoring system in an electric power generation facility, and while that might be bad for the environment, no one is going to die, right? You go after boiler controls, safety systems, flame management systems, now we have to worry about the safety consequences. So we got to find that intersection of what the most important thing is. And maybe I can advance slides. There we go. Yeah, there's also that kind of old perspective of getting left of boom. I've heard it 4 times already at RSA. So now I'm sorry that we put it in our slides.
It's
right?
perfect for bingo if you're playing
yes,
today.
Yes, right. We just got to get AI,
SBOM.
SBOM, yeah, and then we'll hit the whole card. Just trying to get your scorecards out there. Anyway, so our traditional thing, and I used to be deeply involved in incident response, right, is in that right of boom space, right? After something has happened, we react to it, right? We do forensics, we do incident response analysis, we're reacting to what the bad guy is doing. right? But if we want to get out in front of these more consequential things, we need to be moving to the left, right? We need to be looking at how can we position our environment so that it's more defendable or can be more resilient, operate through contested space, right? What are ways that we can actually position ourselves so that the adversary has to be right a whole bunch of times in order to achieve their goals, right? One thing when doing instant response that would always kind of frustrate me is people would be upset when anyone got in the environment. Oh no, a phishing email led to somebody get into our OT environment, right? Did the process go down? Right? Are you still churning out Frito-Lay chips or refining petrochemicals or generating electric power? If you're still doing that, you've won. Every day you achieve your mission, you've won, right? We need to position ourselves to and understand what we need to be resilient to keep doing that, right? Because the adversary only wins when they achieve their goals and deny you yours, right? So that's what we got to be focusing on as we move our defensive resources to be better prioritized to help ensure that we can do our thing while stopping them from doing theirs. I'm struggling, right? So in the Ready Boom side, there's tons of reporting out there. There's all kinds of threat intelligence reports that you can find, and they come out every day of different hacks that have happened, and that's what usually gets a lot of the attention. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I think as we go through this presentation, you're going to find out that actually there's a lot of these hacks are actually very defendable, right? Unfortunately, some of the stuff that's the brush your teeth and eat your vegetables of cybersecurity end up bubbling towards the top of the things that actually have the most mitigative impact against the adversary. Things like changing your default passwords in your controllers has a lot more mitigative impact than trying to deploy EDR across your control system environment, right? And that might not sound sexy, but it's how we're going to get the work done. And we need to figure out a way to articulate that in a context that our business partners understand and can evaluate from a risk management perspective, because we're not doing a very good job of that. And hopefully, we've done some things that'll help us with that work. So how in the world can we do a better job at all of this? And with that, I give you to the smarter Sarah Freeman.
Thank you. As long as I can get the clicker to work. So if you've done any sort of cyber threat intelligence, or if you've been to RSA once or twice before, then this will be also on your bingo scorecard. Risk equals probability times impact. I only put this up to emphasize the fact that this is still used, even though it's been around since probably before I was born. It actually comes from economics. So there's reasons why it was brought in. But this always begs the question, how do we actually calculate probability and impact? Now, the good news is, as Mark alluded to in some of those other slides with the different colors and the different teams, the team of engineering has started to come in the cyber domain. We have more people that are adding their input to be able to say, the effect of this cyber attack will be X. We understand the impact to be a certain thing. We also have things going on in the field of cyber insurance, if that's something you follow as well. So from an actuarial standpoint, there's a lot more work around trying to calculate impact, and there's some question about looking at probability. The reality is probability is one of those things that needs probably more evolution, and that's kind of what we're focused on today a little bit. So if we acknowledge the fact that the probability equation is weak, our ability to define that is poor, then we can start looking at how we can better understand the threat actor coming into that space. Because at a fundamental level, there is no probability, there is no risk to your cyber systems if there is no threat actor. And that's why there's a field of cyber threat intelligence. That's why there will be a number of different booths downstairs, but that's why these people spend a lot of money selling you cyber threat intelligence products. There is value in understanding what the adversary is doing, and in understanding what the adversary is doing, then we can understand what the risk is to our systems. So if we recognize that probability is directly related to a known threat actor, then how do we define the threat actor? Well, this is the other equation that shows up all the time, if you haven't seen it before. Threat equals capability times opportunity times motivation. Now, traditionally in the cyber threat domain, we obsess over capability, in part because it's the easiest to measure. That is a thing we can look at. We can see the outcome of a cyber attack. We can then assess, have conversations, have beers discussing whether or not a certain threat actor is better than the other one, have debates in your office like I tend to do. But in any case, that is something in the green that we've been looking at for a long time. What we haven't spent enough time on are the opportunity and motivation. Generally speaking, the opportunity isn't worth much of our focus because it's assumed that somebody who is determined and well-resourced, so somebody who does receive a certain amount of funding, isn't going to have any problem eventually gaining access to your systems. And the motivation part has been generally ignored because it can change quickly. Like what motivates an actor to attack a specific organization or not? One of the things Mark already mentioned, things like the political climate can change, and with those shifts, then we have different effects in terms of whether or not an actor is going after a particular target. So the reality is, though, even though we tend not to evaluate those things like the adversary motivation, there are things we can be pulling in terms of quantifying our risk. So if we do consider motivation and we look at that, then we should be able to come up with a slightly better equation here where we assess both capability, motivation, and impact. So if you're following all that. So how do we do this? Or why do we have this presentation at all? Infrastructure susceptibility analysis is something we're working on right now at MITRE to try and address some of that, the red part in the previous equation that has been poorly defined up until this point. It's designed to be a systematic, repeatable process so that we can take away some of the bias that inherently comes with cyber threat intelligence and really any intelligence analysis assessment field, which is the human that's doing the assessing themselves. We're interested in understanding what available information is. So if we're talking about, again, the right, left of boom thing, then we're not going to ignore the data from right of boom, but we're going to try and pull more left of boom information into it. We want to better define things like capability and intention. And we're looking ultimately, because the fundamental question is still, what do you spend your money on? How do we better protect our systems? The end goal of this little exercise is actually to understand which attack paths and which outcomes are the most likely, not just the most damaging. And now I'm wishing I had a brighter color on this one. But if we understand the threat, there are two pieces fundamentally to ISA, and you'll notice those back on this slide. So if you understand the threat and you understand the environment, then we can start to calculate these things. So within the threat space, we need to understand their existing capabilities, as I mentioned previously, and their future objectives. On the technology side, and the nice thing about this one is there's been a lot more focus of this of late, including a presentation on Wednesday. So if you are interested, cyber-informed engineering, highly recommend that you investigate that talk. If we understand the use and application of a cyber physical system, whether it be making Frito-Lay chips or refining products, then we can better understand what the impact will be. So we need to understand if the Frito line bags stop coming out or if something could potentially have a physical explosion. There's a big range in there, but you get the idea. We look at both of those things when we're trying to evaluate the most likely attacks under ISA.
Sarah, hold on 1 second.
Sure.
Quick show of hands. Who adds asset criticality to, if you're an industrial asset owner operator in the audience, who actually has asset criticality to the process as part of their asset inventory? I'm going to go with like 2% of you, right? If we don't understand, and as Sarah's mentioned, the consequence-informed engineering is a great methodology for doing that, but if we don't know what actually matters to our physics, how are we going to know what the bad guys are going to target, right? And that's an important point to underscore, is we got to go through that, going back to that, what actually matters to the process. Because guess what? There's a whole bunch of stuff in your industrial control system that doesn't actually fundamentally matter to the criticality of the process. Sorry, Sarah.
No, it's a solid point, and represented it a little bit in that first area all the way on your left. So we need to understand from a cyber asset inventory, of course, SBOMs, HBOMs, the whole acronym list there. In terms of what your devices are, what systems are you relying on, what does customization look like in your enterprise? All these things are really critical. And so we're not trying to discourage any of those efforts if you haven't done any of that. We also need to understand all of the past history of cyber attacks, kind of alluded to this before. This is where I'm going to drop the MITRE is releasing attack version 13, not 7, 13 tomorrow. But the thing there, if you're not familiar with it, there is a readily available on the internet resource you can see to start pulling together factoids of other attacks. And if you're in my field, if you are in cyber physical systems, if you do critical infrastructure protection, there are certain attacks, Not going to name them because I'm not trying to get anybody to yell bingo right now. But there is a series of attacks that everybody talks about when we get into these presentations, because those are the quintessential examples we have of attacking cyber physical systems. The key thing here, however, and I guess I will drop this one, if we were to look at something like SolarWinds, the critical thing we want to keep in mind is that there are more than one way to get into your systems, to get into your enterprise. And so we have to at least be cognizant of the fact that an IT vulnerability, exploit, or campaign may, in certain environments, result in access into a cyber physical environment. I'm not going to expand on that, but we can have lots of debate at the end, and I'm hoping that somebody got really fired up and has got some really good questions about those things. I don't want to talk about those other attacks right now. Then we want to look at the capabilities. Again, you demonstrate stage 1 access campaigns if you're familiar with the SANS attack kill chain. We like to use that one to explain these activities. So both stage 1 and stage 2. So we don't want to distract ourselves by the latest and greatest drop in the newspaper of a hack or an effect or an attack, but we do want to recognize that some of these access pathways are relevant. Because if your system is secure enough that you truly do not have access to your cyber physical systems, then your likelihood of attack goes down. As we start to decrease the pathways into your environment, the likelihood of attack does go down. So we have to acknowledge that. And then ultimately, we want to better understand kind of the big question mark on the end here. What are the attacker objectives? What are attacker expectations? Because you can want anything you want, but if it's not reasonable because of the specific technology or architecture or design that you have deployed against your systems, then it's not worth worrying about. That, in particular, is critical when we start looking at likelihood, because likelihood of a specific attack against a specific enterprise is going to vary a lot depending on how that technology is deployed and used in that environment. So just a little bit of a note here on sophistication. When we assess on the threat intelligence space, when we assess things like whether or not an actor is sophisticated, we're really talking about these 3 areas. And a lot of times that gets glossed over in some of the publications that come out, but I think it's important to highlight. You can have a very sophisticated cyber weapon that has an effect against the system. Now I guess I am going to drop, not that it's the most sophisticated, but if you were to compare Indestroyer or Crash Override, so 2016 attack in Ukraine versus the 2015 campaign that resulted in pretty much the same thing in Ukraine, the difference between the attack capabilities was significant. Now, I would never describe either one of those attacks as particularly sophisticated, but there was a difference in sophistication of the tool set. In terms of the access, we see historically things like SolarWinds demonstrate a degree of sophistication in both the access and the targeting that we don't necessarily witness in other places. So it's important that even if you have an unsophisticated capability, if you have a sophisticated access or targeting campaign, you can still be effective. So when we're measuring capabilities, when we're talking about whether or not an actor has the capacity to attack a specific system, we have to consider each one of these areas. And again, second drop of the day, if you are interested in correlating those things, you can look at the MITRE ATT&CK materials, and there's a number of different places you can go on both the enterprise and on the OT side as well. So how do we go about doing ISA? Well, I've kind of already alluded to this first piece, but I think particularly if you're going to start in the threat space, the other way to do this would be understanding the technology space. So if you are on the engineering side, I guess you could start from the bottom and work up. But we start on the cyber threat side and the intelligence side with understanding the existing capabilities. We then want to try and define the attacker objectives and determine whether or not there is a correlation between those two things, whether or not their existing capabilities are sufficient to meet their goals, or if there's a growth area that has to occur in order for them to be successful. Then at the same time, because of things like cyber-informed engineering, we want to be it's key to kind of consider the fact that the technology has certain functionality and capabilities that may or may not allow the adversary to be effective. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, even if the adversary is successful, gaining access to your system, performing an attack, and having an effect, if the effect is insignificant to your operations, then it's not something that should be prioritized in terms of calculating where we spend our resources. So if you go in a little bit more in depth here, when we're talking about that first capability, that first area box, understanding the capabilities, So you obviously want to look at things that have been demonstrated as stage 1 and stage 2. We also want to pay attention a little bit to the vulnerabilities, the CVEs that are specifically being attacked or sought in certain environments. Sometimes the adversaries, you'll get reporting, particularly from the US government side, that doesn't necessarily state whether or not the attacker is effective in exploiting a vulnerability, but we will have materials that say an adversary is interested in exploiting CVE such and such, and those are the kinds of things we want to understand. Because in the world of vulnerability identification, particularly on the offensive side, one of the things that we have to be cognizant of the fact is that CVEs, vulnerabilities, come in trees. They're not individual parts and pieces. It's not like a leaf on the ground. These are connected in a whole ecosystem. And so if somebody's spending the energy to identify certain vulnerabilities in a component, a piece of software, a third-party library, what have you, then there's a possibility that there's been more than one piece of that technology that has been identified to be vulnerable. And as we exploit, or if we review those exploits, we can see how they chain together. This is kind of key if you are trying to understand how an adversary is going to shift their capability from a target A to target B, even if those two sites have different or related technologies. So the other thing that you want to pay attention to is, particularly on the cyber-physical side, the nice thing that we have is usually we have a nice range of time between when adversary was successful compromising a site and when they actually have an effect. And hopefully, in a perfect world, the cyber threat intelligence domain gives you a little bit of information about that as it's happening. So you'll get information about access campaigns that are dropped into the news or into your threat feeds. And you can use that even though it wasn't against your own systems. You can kind of say like, oh, threat actor monkeypox is currently targeting all things related to upstream energy, refining processes. So what does that mean for me if I'm located in this part? Maybe I don't have any upstream facilities, so maybe I'm not as concerned about that. But maybe if you are looking at the downstream, if you are an oil and natural gas entity and you are a proud owner of several refineries, it is significant that somebody is looking at upstream facilities, even if it only disrupts the amount of product that comes to your door for refining purposes, because it demonstrates an interest in the full field. The question is, from an intelligence standpoint, has the adversary learned anything by targeting the upstream facilities? Well, you could say at best, maybe. I mean, it's a solid maybe, right? Because they've said, they've at least understood that there is theoretically a supply chain process here that they're interested in disrupting. But we don't necessarily know whether or not they've developed any of the capabilities that would be applicable to both environments. So you can, again, use some of the MITRE resources for this, but you don't have to, really. It's just about keeping track of how an adversary is growing in each one of those domains. Again, you'll notice that the text is really small here, but I kind of made it bigger over here. We have the effect and attack area, but we also have things like targeting on this as well, because we want to continue to assess capability across those three domains. Now, understanding the objectives, this is where we start to move more into the soft, squishy space of cyber threat intelligence. And people are more or less comfortable with this depending on their personality type. But you can start with kind of those general questions I already stated, like, is an adversary interested in targeting multiple things in an energy sector? If you see a series of campaigns built up over time, then obviously somebody has an interest in that entire field, not just one aspect of it. If you're interested in targeting distribution electric systems in Ukraine, then it stands to reason a logical place for a moderately successful cyber attack in December 2015 is to attack transmission systems in 2016. This is not truly predictive forecasting. This isn't magic. This is just logic. Somebody who tries to have an effect will continue to try and have a better and better effect every year, unless you discourage them from leaving your systems.
Well, and one thing I want to add into this too, Sarah, is those objectives, right? We often focus on turning it off or shutting down the power grid and all those things, right? And that's what all the headlines always say. But that is a very immature perspective on adversary objectives, right? And quite frankly, going after the integrity of systems may be a lot more interesting and potentially more impactful from a consequence perspective on your environment than just turning something off, right? Because turning something off is obvious, right? We no longer are getting that product or service that we were trying to do. But making it slightly less effective, or maybe some downstream from you, owner or operator or piece of equipment that's leveraging your stuff, is no longer effective because your product is just a little bit out of spec, right? And so the real compendium of real adversaries is much more broad from an effects perspective than just trying to turn it off, right? That is usually kind of the last resort or most observable tactic that an adversary is going to try and use. Now, granted, it's a lot harder to do those things in the middle, right? But their goals are going to be different. And we can actually do some things to measure those goals and try and figure out what that actually looks like.
So when we start talking about how do you measure the relative significance of different things, particularly given the fact that supply chains in a lot of these domains are complex, meaning one vendor solution could be used in multiple applications, one software development tool, one compiler may be used to build multiple pieces of code, all of that. How do we go about understanding which one of these things should be weighted more heavily than others when, again, we're getting back to probabilities and at some point we have to have a number? Well, this is our first attempt at trying to do something like that. It's not uncommon to talk about things like confidence with regards to cyber threat intelligence assessments, but it's not something you'll see every day. So in the green here, we're talking about things that an adversary has done and has demonstrated in such a way it's observable to us. We have no reason not to treat those as high confidence pieces of data, and such in our math actually weight those things a little bit more heavily. So known TTPs, exploited CVEs. But as we start to move away from those very concrete things on the right of boom side, then we have to start saying what is the trajectory of adversary activity telling us? Where are they going? So things like programmatic goals, procured materials, interested training. If you were paying attention to the news last week, weird trollers hanging outside wind farms in Europe, those kinds of things. These things are noteworthy and things that need to be considered, but they need to be evaluated at a much lower confidence than something like a demonstrated capability as part of a stage 2 attack in Ukraine. Then if we go a little bit beyond that, how else do we understand whether or not an adversary is going to be effective at what they want to do? Well, things like the ease of exploitation, whether or not the perceived attack goals are feasible or moderately or significantly challenging. It makes a big difference whether or not we're talking about something that is really straightforward versus something that requires a significant amount of investment in order to pull off. This is particularly true of cyber-physical systems, which often require a fair amount of material investment in order to be effective, but not exclusively. So depending on what an adversary's interests are in terms of those kinds of things, you could say, oh, somebody has procured representative hardware to investigate in their own environments quietly, or they can go after a system that's already deployed in the environment. The difference is, as a cyber threat intelligence analyst, I'm more likely to see the shadows, the flickers, and the waves that are caused by somebody attacking a real-world system. And then kind of weighted the least significantly in our calculations here, whether or not the capability has been demonstrated by somebody else, or if some other group or organization unassociated has put forth materials that could be of use. And what do I mean by this? Well, way back in the day, if you did do the cyber-physical stuff, you were into critical infrastructure protection, one of the things we talk about a lot were the SCADA Plus packs, the Canvas tools. So whether or not you have, for example, a widget that gets installed into your Metasploit that makes it a little bit easier for somebody who's not very smart to hack something, that kind of stuff at the most basic level. But the other thing you say is, like, in the public domain, if somebody were, say, not to purchase a for-purchase product, but if they were to, say, attend RSA or attend Black Hat or attend C3, what were the topics of conversation in those areas? Is it particularly relevant today to be talking about rail systems, for example? And so what can we take away from that kind of level of knowledge in the public domain? This is just a different view of the similar thing. Again, green, using the RSA colors here. Green obviously weighted more heavily. Things that are in the purpley pink, again, stronger together colors, less significant. So finally, understanding the technology functions. A little bit less time here, but I think that this is something you will hear more of if you attend more of the cyber physical systems track. Couple of things to highlight, I would say. Particularly the second bullet, how is a cyber-physical system designed, deployed, commissioned, and maintained throughout its life cycle? Because at different times of cyber-physical systems' life, there is going to be greater or lesser risk that somebody will be able to have access to that system or make modifications to it. So one of the things we started to talk about is at what points do we expect a system to be at lesser or greater risk? And then ultimately, because of the fact that there are certain points where the exposure is higher to these systems, is there also a change in what organizations are touching your systems or your components at those various times?
Great example. Who's got an asset in a maintenance cycle right now? Anybody? Right? When you put your assets in a maintenance cycle, usually all kinds of people are in there, remote access, they're updating all kinds of things. That is a perfect opportunity space for an adversary to get after your environment, right? You might be locked down tight on a regular schedule, but when it's in maintenance, oftentimes it's get it done as fast as it can to get the asset back online, right? And the adversary can exploit those windows of opportunity for them.
This pink category, again, kind of the last thing, understanding the effect, but more importantly, not just the effect that's theoretically possible if you're in the cyber threat domain, but if you're working with an actual organization that has deployed this system, what is possible in their specific case. And again, I think this one is a little bit more intuitive than some of the others if you are a controller, maintainer, or designer of those systems, if you deploy them yourself. Again, what the goal here, though, ultimately, is to try and understand what of one of these systems, as we go through these calculations, are most at risk. Where do we expect the attacker will go, and what do we expect the effect would be against those systems moving forward? And ultimately, the goal of what we're trying to get out here is recognize that there are a number of different things that can be modified in these systems or technologies, but we want to do that intelligently. We don't want to just spend money unless you are independently wealthy in your organization, in which case I will gladly take some internal funding for some other R&D efforts. But in general, we don't have that luxury. And even if we were so wealthy in our organizations, we don't have time to do all those things. So we need to understand which places are reasonable to expect the adversary to move in the future, not just where they've been in the past.
Handoff complete. So how do we actually use this, right? So I think what's important to understand here is that taking all these different aspects of securing your systems together, ultimately, kind of as I led off, the purpose, the intention behind here is what to go fix next, right? What is the next thing you need to do, right? And as Sarah kind of walked through, you have to take into account not just how you are vulnerable, right, but also what the adversary is showing that they're going to do and what you can reasonably expect that they might be doing based on some other kind of more traditional intelligence analysis type things that ultimately help you understand where that risk truly is, right? And that's where that capability kind of piece comes in, right? But then we have to couple that with how the physics works in your environment, what the state of your systems are, right? Where are you already strong, right? Who has isolated air-gapped networks? Oh, you're lying. I've never seen one. Actually, that's not true. I have seen one truly gapped system, and it was rock-gapped, not air-gapped. So that one's the only one that I'll have count, right? But there's always a way into the environment. But I'll tell you, those of you that raised your hands, maybe now regretting having done so, but you likely, if you think you have an air gap of your system, you likely have a lot smaller surface area, like Sarah was talking about kind of at the beginning, than those that have permissive access between their different levels of Perdumo, right? And so that, if an adversary is relying on the accessibility of the environment and you have a relatively constrained thing, you're actually good there, right? You don't necessarily need to apply additional resources and mitigation in reducing the aperture to the adversary because you've already done that, right? And so it's about not just understanding the bad guy, but understanding yourself and looking at your current security posture and finding out where the bad guy has capability and intent and you're weak. That's where you need to prioritize, right? Because at the end of the day, we can't fix all of the things, and quite frankly, a lot of things are never going to actually get fixed, right? But there are some things that if you fix now can actually really close off the adversary's pathways and capabilities into your environment and ultimately avoid the bad day for you, right? And really, that will, again, it's about maximizing your impact to the adversary, how much you frustrate their operations, on how little it costs you, right? That's what we're trying to solve for here with ISA. So, oh, I hit the wrong button. So if we're maximizing for that impact, right? If you look at your board of weaknesses, right? And this is just a notional example using the attack for ICS model, but I'll bet you that if you look just at your vulnerabilities, right, it's lots of red in your ledger, right? What ISA is really trying to do is incorporate that impact and that adversary probability assessment and say, okay, well, of those weaknesses that we have, and we all know we have way too many, what are the ones where those overlapping fields of fire happen, right? And that can kick out priorities, right? And so in this kind of notional example, we've got weaknesses and impact. Now we have 5 different things that we need to fix in our systems. And oh, by the way, we've already got 3 of them checked off, right? We've already changed all the default credentials. We've already fixed the accounts. We've already fixed exploitation remote services. But we need to actually work on a couple of things, right? Like project file injection. Just super curious. Anyone actually like hashing their project files as the ladder logic gets uploaded to controllers? And checking to make sure that it's in your configuration management database? Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay, just fun fact for me. But like these are the things that we need to now, we have a priority list of what to work on and what we've already gotten done, right? And that's what really ISA can help you with. So what are the next steps? What do you do? What do we do after this presentation, right? Know the bad guy, right? Understand, use that threat intelligence information that's out there. Know who might actually target us. Who is targeting people that are like us, upstream from us, downstream from us? Why would they come after us? What would their goals be? Do they want to disable us? Do they want to stop us from producing Frito-Lay chips for a couple of weeks because they want to introduce a new smart snack into the market? I always pick on Frito-Lay. No, just a thing I like to do because I know some people that work out there. But like, what would those goals be? And then can they actually do it? Right? Do they have the capability to do so? Right? This is the kind of the threat intelligence piece. And then it's about knowing yourself. Right? What actually is important? Right? Not everything is critical. Right? What can you do without? I'll tell you, many operators will tell you, oh no, we need the whole SCADA system online to do our thing. Right? That's probably not true. Right? If a piece of equipment went offline tomorrow, could you still do your mission? Right? That is no longer a critical asset. Like I said, most of you didn't assign that criticality to the process as part of your asset inventory. Right? Do you have the visibility to see? Right? If an adversary, one of the reasons that Sarah mentioned there's a long lead time from initial compromise to actual successful exploitation in the ICS cases that we have is because it takes a long time for the bad guy to learn about you. The system is transparent for you, right? But would we be able to see them banging around trying to collect intelligence? Right, in that stage 1? Do you have the telemetry for that? And then can we be resilient? In a lot of cases, you might be able to actually just take the example of the Ukrainians in 2015, right? Once they realized that the SCADA system was the problem, they just turned it off. Why? Because they had the expertise in manual operations. They knew how to do it. Their electric power systems were designed in such a way that they could be manually operated. So they got power back on between 30 minutes and 2 hours because they just turned the SCADA system off and went back to manual operations, right? Could you do that? And then if you think you could, I saw some ups and downs and some left and rights when I asked that question. If you were an up and down person, when was the last time you tried, right? How long could you operate your environment without the control system in the loop, right? Because that gives you, again, more time, right? And helps you prioritize about which resources you need to do your mitigation. So those are the things that you can do to kind of do little takeaways. We want to give you a couple minutes for questions if anybody has them. But before we do that,
I'm just obligated to state that I'm going to be, if anybody wants to chat or fight about this later, ask more questions. I do have a book right now at the RSA bookstore. I'm happy to sign it or not, as you see fit. But it's actually on consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, which is under the umbrella of cyber-informed engineering, which is being presented on Wednesday. So if you are familiar or interested in that, but how do we understand and calculate impact versus probability of things, or understand how the adversary is operating more on the engineering side, happy to chat more about it. Countering cyber sabotage.
And with that, if you're interested in more things about ISA, we have a website up there which has some information about it, MITRE.org/ISA. We have an email address. Sarah and my email addresses are down there at the bottom if you want to reach out to us directly. And otherwise, be happy to take anybody's questions. The
Or
5
encourage
minutes we have.
hearty debate.
Yeah, or hearty debate. Who wants to tell us we're stupid?
For your opinion, is better to fix the vulnerability with the high vulnerabilities, or to integrate the perfect scenario of an attacker that to improve several fix on one focus and
So how do you prioritize between fixing one versus fixing many?
yes,
So
better
in,
to do an assessment, a vulnerability assessment on the perimeter, or is the better to do several pen tests and individuate the perfect scenario to an attacker?
So yeah, I think that the going after perfect is usually a great way to fail. So I think looking at, and really what we're trying to do here is look for those commonalities in threat actor tactics that are going to have the most impact to the most different adversary kill chains, right? Because it is true that the adversary has to be right a lot of time, and you don't have to disrupt the entire kill chain. You just got to stop it somewhere and make them move. That imposes cost in their system. So if you can make one change that fixes one problem for you, but ultimately causes the adversary to have to branch in 7 or 8 different directions to achieve the same outcomes, you've won. So going for those small incremental improvements that have the most effective impact is kind of what we'd recommend versus the perfect attack scenario. In the back.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so talk about prioritizing to maximize impact being cost to the adversary, right, to deal with it. This may be just kind of nonsense opinion stuff, but prioritizing what you go after for that, or prioritizing it towards the criticality of any component to your mission. Does that make sense?
So
Yes.
if I sum it up, the question was, do I prioritize against what does the most bad to the bad guy or what has the most impact to my mission? Did I sum that correctly?
Yeah, resiliency, right?
Resiliency.
You can fight through the attack.
Right.
so I would say unless you have an unlimited budget, one of those magical budget people, usually from governments, but unless you're one of those people with magical budgets, most people don't have the option to be able to make their prime focus disrupting the adversary. We want to disrupt the adversary. I always like messing with the adversaries, but that is not really reasonable in most organizations. So I guess what I would say is if you are familiar with CIE or CCE, for example, which tend to prioritize solely on impact, this would be an add-on calculation in a lot of ways to that effort. The risk, when you are prioritizing risk in a business sense, obviously we have to consider multiple things, one of which is the impact to your operations. But it's also whether or not you feel comfortable adopting a certain amount of risk. If you have really robust cyber insurance, then you may choose to de-emphasize or change focus from one area to another. So I would say it's neither A or B in your setup. But if I was going to lean one way, it's probably by mitigating my personal opinion here, but mitigating those things that are of highest impact but are also the most likely. Because when we do the impact calculations, sometimes what we don't tell you is there's a lot of things that have pretty bad impacts, but we don't have any way to say which one of those 7 things is the most likely. And so that's what we're really trying to get at. Of these 7 things that scored the highest, if you're going to say these things will definitely kill you, or your preferred poison, pick your poison, so to speak, then maybe we change shift and we only look at the first 2 of that set. Not because they have the highest impact score, but because they're the most likely to occur because of all that other stuff we're considering.
Going after the bad guy does feel good, but usually doesn't do the most good. That's my answer to that question. We're here.
I think we're all, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
I think we're all familiar with kind of the whack-a-mole that happens to a lot of adversaries, where you get a lot of threat actors who will just kind of engage in targets of opportunity and exploit them, and then that makes headlines, and everyone looks at the patch, and then they look for the next target opportunity. I'm curious if you would frame the ISA approach as a way to be smarter about the whack-a-mole, like picking which holes to whack, or a way to kind of pull back and stop doing whack-a-mole.
I don't want to whack the holes. I want to fill them. right? Because then they can't come back through
Gonna
that same
cement
hole.
the hole.
Right. Let's
before they
fill the
show up.
holes instead. We just hit time, so if you have additional questions or comments for Sarah or I, we'll be hanging out here for a little while. Thank you
We
for
can
your attention.
continue
Mark
that
and Sarah.
conversation if
Enjoy
you're willing in
RSA.
the hallway.